The September breeze was honeyed with fried dough and caramel apples as the sun set behind the Ferris wheel at the St. Louis County Fair. For the Harris family, it was going to be another cherished memory, one of sticky fingers, games, and laughter. But that night would instead become the beginning of a nightmare that would terrorize Minnesota for decades. "Fire!" Freya Harris shouted, her voice little more than a shout over the carnival music. "Fia!" She stepped out into the crowd, her eyes scanning, her voice growing more pointed with every shout as she looked for a glimpse of Blue Jacket. Blonde ponytail, David Harris ran back from the cotton candy stand, two fluffy pink piles of sugar in his hands. "She's not with you?" he questioned, his tone constricting. The snacks fell to the ground, abandoned. One instant, Freya was there. The next, vanished. What had started out as bewilderment turned to terror in seconds. Fair security moved swiftly to the frantic calls of the parents, closing exit gates and deploying personnel to search between rides and game booths. Seconds before, the announcer had been enthusiastically touting the prize-winning pigs. Now, his voice was slightly shaking as he announced a missing 10-year-old girl wearing a blue coat. As darkness descended, the festival's sparkling lights lost their appeal, becoming sinister in the fading light. Flashlights cut across dark spaces between tents as volunteers queued up to sweep across every corner of the festival grounds. Parents gripped their children more tightly. Powerless to witness the Harris family's world crumble before them, she wouldn't just go missing, Sarah argued, her voice cracking as she addressed a police officer taking notes. "She knows better." David put an arm across her shoulders, the two of them looking at the vacant spot between the cotton candy booth and the Ferris wheel, 50 feet which seemed to have swallowed up their daughter. The fairgrounds were empty by midnight, save for the police. The Ferris wheel was motionless and quiet against the night sky, lights extinguished. The flashing red and blue of police cars coated everything in a cold, rhythmic light no one could have guessed. That evening in 1997 would be the start of one of Minnesota's most eerie enigmas, or that the answer had been right in front of us all along. You're interested in true cold cases that ultimately got justice? Be sure to subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? September 13th, 1997, began like any other fair day for the Harris family. There was that crisp Minnesota morning chill that spoke of summer's finality, the temperature remaining comfortably in the mid-60s, ideal fair weather. David Harris, who taught high school science, had marked this Saturday on the calendar several months in advance. His daughter Freya lived for Fair Day. She was up before the alarm, Sarah later explained to investigators. She'd already laid out her favorite jeans and that blue jacket. She'd been counting down for weeks. The family arrived just in time, as the fair opened at 10 a.m., joining the cheerful throng of visitors streaming through the gates. David purchased the all-day ride wristbands, the big orange ones the attendant clipped onto Freya's little wrist as she almost bounced with joy. "Let's go on the tilt-a-whirl first, Dad," she had pleaded, pulling at his sleeve. Her blonde ponytail bounced as she moved along, that blue jacket wrapped tightly around her waist until the onset of evening coolness. By mid-afternoon, the fairgrounds were crowded, more than 15,000, a record attendance that would make the search all but impossible later. The Harris family spent hours wandering through livestock barns, crafts booths, and carnival stands. Freya even won a tiny stuffed penguin at the ring toss. "We were having the perfect day," David would tell interviews later, his voice empty. "Just a normal, perfect day." They got off at about 5:45 p.m. at the food court. Sarah desired to walk around the quilting show, and David volunteered to walk Freya over to get some cotton candy before they reunited to ride the Ferris wheel, her old reliable last ride of the evening. "I'll see you two at the Ferris wheel in 15 minutes, Sarah said, giving a hasty hug to her daughter before walking off toward the exhibition hall. That window of 15 minutes between cotton candy and Ferris wheel would be the defining feature of the next 20 years of inquiry. Security footage later recovered was of David and Freya standing by the cotton candy booth at 8:52 p.m. The vendor recalled them distinctly, a wide-eyed little girl holding a stuffed penguin around her arm, and a father looking at his watch as he waited for their food. She asked if she could go ahead and get in line for the Ferris wheel while I stood in line for the cotton candy. David explained to officers through sobs. It was about 50 yards down. I could see the ride from where I was. I said, okay. The vendor attested to having observed Freya exit alone in the direction of the Ferris wheel. 4 witnesses later came forward and said they observed a girl with her description, blue jacket, blonde ponytail, passing by the ring toss games. And then, nothing. By the time David arrived at the Ferris wheel some 3 minutes later, Freya was nowhere to be found. Initially, he thought she must have gotten distracted, presumably to watch a game or look for her mom. However, upon Sarah's arrival at 6:05 p.m., when neither of them had spotted her, a growing sense of discomfort settled in. We went separate ways to search for her, Sarah explained later. I figured she might have returned to the cotton candy stand or paused to examine prizes. David checked the restrooms, questioning all the patrons if they had seen a little girl in a blue jacket. By 6:30 p.m., the Harrises had called fair security. By 7 p.m., the St. Louis County Police were dispatched. Officer Mark Jennings was the first to respond. At first, he figured that this was a case of a child who'd wandered off, something that occurred more frequently than most parents knew. In the majority of these incidents, Jennings recorded in his report, the child returns within an hour. They get lost in a crowd, follow someone, or need to use a restroom. But something about the parents' assurance prompted me to act right away. Security activated their missing child protocol, shutting all but one exit gate and posting staff at each exit. Loudspeaker announcements sounded every 5 minutes. Volunteers started to organize search parties, searching the fairgrounds area by area. As the sun set, the sense of urgency intensified. Additional officers arrived. The main entrance was positioned with a command post. At 10 p.m., the news story was already up on local news. The initial broadcast included Freya's cheerful school photo, her dimple being visible on the right cheek, and the title was, 10-year-old girl missing from county fair, last seen wearing jeans and blue jacket. The community reacted instantly. By morning, over 200 volunteers had arrived at the fairgrounds, ready to assist. The fair was still closed as investigators took security video, interviewed vendors, and created a minute-by-minute timeline of the Harris family's activities. This wasn't just another missing child case. The Harrises were well known in St. Louis, Minnesota, a tight-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. David was a high school science teacher. Sarah volunteered at the library's children's reading program. Freya was in my daughter's swim class, one volunteer told reporters. She's the kind of kid who always shares her snacks. Who would take a child like that? As word got around, there was more to learn about Freya. A 4th grader at Lakeside Elementary, she was a bright and inquisitive student who was a whiz at science and art. Her teacher said she was thoughtful, with an imagination bigger than her backpack. She played weekend soccer, hunted for interesting rocks, and had most recently begun to learn the violin. The small, stuffed penguin she'd won that day, later discovered discarded beside a trash can near the Ferris wheel, was intended to become part of her collection of stuffed animals, every one of which was named after a well-known scientist. But as the initial 48 hours elapsed, detectives encountered increasing obstacles. The fair's security system was antiquated, only protecting major areas such as entrances, the midway, and money handling areas. The crucial area between the cotton candy booth and the Ferris wheel, where Freya disappeared, was an unguarded blind spot. And since over 15,000 people had come to the fair that day, hundreds of possible witnesses had already left before any search could be initiated. Detective Samuel Reeves, assigned as lead investigator, felt the weight of what was quickly becoming one of the most high-profile missing person cases in Minnesota's history. We're dealing with a narrow window of opportunity in a crowded public space, Detective Samuel Reeves told his team during the first official briefing. His voice was steady, but the fatigue was already showing. Either this was a carefully planned abduction or a crime of opportunity by someone who knew how to exploit the fair's blind spots. The search expanded out of the fairgrounds to neighboring suburbs, wooded areas, and even drainage ditches. K-9 teams detected Freya's smell from the cotton candy booth to the Ferris wheel. but it disappeared suddenly along a service road behind the carnival rides. That road, police discovered, was open to vendors and employees, an easy exit route overlooked in plain sight. The FBI was involved by Monday morning. Agent Diana Mercer, a veteran of child abduction investigations, came with new eyes and a silent intensity. She saw something immediately that didn't sit right with her. The timing, the location, the absence of credible witnesses in the crowd, she wrote in her initial report. This is intentional, like someone knew precisely what they were doing, possibly even someone who knows the layout of the fair. As the third day of searching went on with no Freya in sight, the emphasis slowly shifted. Rescue gave way to recovery. The Harris family would not budge from the command center. Caffeine and raw hope fueled Sarah, who held Freya's beloved otter toy, a tattered plush animal she'd named Einstein. David went hours without rest, back and forth across the fairgrounds, replaying each step they'd taken on that Saturday, hoping to find something, anything, they might have missed. What started as a nightmare for one family had turned into a community mania and the detective's most baffling enigma. And tragically, no one knew it yet. But this case would never be solved for much longer than anyone could ever have dreamed. By the fourth day, the St. Louis County Police Department had established a specialized task force. They had commandeered a conference room at headquarters, its walls now covered with maps of the fairgrounds, timelines, and photographs. Freya's cheerful school portrait took center stage, her big, shining eyes both an inspiration and a chilling reminder of the stakes. Detective Reeves, who was running on empty, presided over the morning briefing. "We've got more than 200 witness statements," he rubbed his eyes, "and they don't add up. We need to concentrate on the contradictions." The witness statements created a muddled picture. A street food vendor reported that he saw Freya walking by herself past his stall at 5:57 p.m. in the direction of the Ferris wheel. A 2-year-old mother said she spotted a girl who looked like her outside the restrooms at 6:05 p.m. After David had reached the ride, and a teen couple stated they saw a blue-jacketed blonde girl being walked to the parking lot by a man at 6:10 p.m., but they couldn't agree on whether he wore a red or a black hat. The fair was packed. Agent Mercer explained later to the Harris family. People were distracted and nobody was looking for trouble until it was too late. We're working to piece these accounts together, but memory is fragile, especially under stress. Then came the first real lead. Grandmother Elaine Winters, 67, had been sitting on a bench along the service road behind the Ferris wheel. She remembered observing a man who was dressed like a maintenance employee speaking with a young girl. He was showing her something in his toolbox, Winters informed police. I didn't think twice about it because he was wearing one of those blue fair staff shirts with the logo. Her story prompted a full-blown inquiry of fair employees and vendors. Over 120 workers were interviewed. Their activity during the critical time frame tracked and examined. Background checks turned up 17 employees with prior criminal histories, most minor, such as DUIs or small drug charges. But 3 names stood out for other reasons. Year-old tilt-a-whirl operator Martin Kelly had a 15-year-old conviction for assault. Jason Merritt, 38, a carnival company traveling electrician, had been questioned years ago in a child luring case in Wisconsin only 3 years prior, although charges were never brought. And for detectives, all those sorts of things were impossible to disregard. Robert Dawson, 45, was in charge of fairgrounds maintenance. On paper, he was a run-of-the-mill worker, but police soon learned he had a sealed juvenile record, which they had to ask the court to unseal. All 3 men, Kelly, Merritt, and Dawson, were called in for questioning. Kelly also came armed with extensive maintenance records and several witnesses vouching for the fact that he'd been running the tilt-a-whirl at precisely the moment Freya vanished. Merritt's co-workers defended him as well. He'd been repairing electrical problems way across the fairgrounds. As for Dawson, his juvenile record proved to be fairly minor, a charge of burglary at age 16, nothing violent or sexual in nature. Security footage placed him in the exhibition hall bathrooms, fixing a plumbing issue when Freya vanished. Detective Reeves addressed the media on day 5, his tone calm but weary. "We're clearing suspects as quickly as they emerge," he told reporters. "But we're not ruling anyone out permanently." Meanwhile, forensic investigators scoured the key area between the cotton candy booth and the Ferris wheel. They picked up hundreds of items: drop tickets, candy wrappers, a child's hair clip, residual fingerprints along railings, and hundreds of footprints in the loose dirt along the edge of the midway. The volume was staggering, recalled forensic technician Lisa Novak. In a normal crime scene, evidence tells a story, but at a county fair with thousands of visitors, everything's contaminated. We're looking for a needle in a stack of needles, but there was something that stood out. Freya's cuddly penguin, found outside a trash can close to the Ferris wheel. It bore her fingerprints and DNA, showing that she'd gotten that far at least. Trace evidence also turned up something anomalous: an unexplained fiber that wasn't on her clothing, in her home, or from anything provided by the fair's vendors. As is standard practice, detectives shifted their focus to the family. David and Sarah Harris consented to it all: interviews, complete searches of their house and cars, and even DNA testing. On the 6th day, both of them offered to take polygraph tests. "The polygraph is a tool, not a verdict," Agent Mercer told them in advance. "We use it to rule out possibilities and draw a sharper line of focus." Sarah passed without issue. David's results showed slight elevations when discussing the moment he last saw Freya, but examiners believed it was stress-related, an all-too-human reaction to guilt and grief. "I keep replaying it," David told investigators in a later interview. "If I'd just walked her to the Ferris wheel, if I'd kept her next to me, 3 minutes, that's all it took." From there, the inquiry was broadened to cover registered sex offenders living within a 50-mile radius. 27 names were noted. They were all interviewed, their alibis screened, and their activity checked. 25 were cleared: work records, surveillance, or eyewitnesses placing them in their last known locations. 2 suspects remained. Gerald Hoffman, 51, said he had been alone at home during the festival. No witnesses, no evidence. Police searched his house from top to bottom. No trace of Freya. No physical evidence, nothing. Then there was 39-year-old Thomas Larson, who originally claimed to police that he'd been away from town seeing relatives in Duluth. But when the agents called his sister, she disproved him. He'd canceled plans for the trip. Caught in the lie, Larson confessed that he hadn't. Wanted to confess to having been drinking at a local tavern that evening, despite being on probation for DUI. Tavern tabs and eyewitnesses at the Rusty Nail Tavern vindicated his alibi, and he was cleared of involvement. As weeks turned into days, the search was a haze of dead ends and hopelessness. A truck stop waitress 30 miles north of St. Louis spotted a man eating with a girl who resembled Freya, but surveillance revealed it to be a traveling dad and daughter from Canada. Then, a hunter discovered a blue jacket far in the woods, and a wholesale search ensued using helicopters and canines. But it wasn't Freya's jacket, and the trail went cold once more. The most tragic of false leads occurred on day 17, a school bus. Driver in the adjacent Carlton County described seeing a blonde child walking alone along a country road, someone who looked remarkably like Freya. Within hours, search parties were scouring the grounds, hearts racing with a spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this bad dream would at long last be over. But when they located the girl, she was another blonde youngster who had simply cut school to see a friend. The optimism that had temporarily raised the whole town crashed back down, leaving the search party and the Harris family emotionally exhausted. As publicity increased, so did the imagination of the public. In the absence of a body, a ransom demand, or a tangible lead, the gaping holes in the story were filled with rumor. Rumors traveled quicker than facts. Others blamed a newly released convict who had only recently returned to live with his mother, although police already had verified that he was in the hospital during the fair. Others wondered if there might be a custody battle. Although David and Sarah had been married for 15 years and were very much in love, the longest-lasting rumor, though, was of a van with out-of-state license plates allegedly spotted near the service entrance of the fairgrounds that evening. Dozens claimed to have seen it. Yet despite their widespread canvassing of security tapes, their interviews with witnesses, and their check of vehicle registrations, police couldn't turn up a single shred of evidence that the phantom van had ever been there. In a charged town hall meeting 4 weeks after Freya went missing, Sheriff Michael Donovan spoke to escalating frustration. "We know the community wants answers," he said to the assemblage. "But gossip doesn't get us closer to Freya. We need facts, not rumors." Behind closed doors, the case was stalling. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit gave them a profile that indicated the abductor was probably male, had visited the fairgrounds before, and was probably working there, or at least a regular attendee. This wasn't someone who happened to stumble upon an idea. This was someone who plotted, or at least knew, the opportune moment to act. "This doesn't seem to be a crime of opportunity that was random," Agent Mercer reported. "The spot, the time, the absence of witnesses in the middle of all these people all point to someone who was familiar with the fair's weak spots and how to exploit them." By 6 weeks in, the investigation had ground to a halt. Around-the-clock officers were redeployed back to their normal beats. That 24-hour command center that had been humming with activity reduced its hours to business hours. And those daily news conferences, which had attracted every big media outlet in the area, dwindled to weekly briefings with few tidbits to reveal. To the Harris family, that lost momentum was abandonment. Sarah quit her job to operate a volunteer search center out of a donated storefront downtown. Tips, maps, and flyers papered the walls. But with each passing day, the number of new calls dwindled. David, who had been gone for 3 weeks, grudgingly returned to his classroom at the insistence of his principal. Routine might do the trick, she'd said, but nothing seemed routine anymore. "Entering that classroom was the most difficult thing I've ever had to do," David remembered later. 30 students all looking at me, each one of them aware that my daughter was missing, each one of them wondering if I was all right, and I wasn't. When 2 months went by without significant progress, Detective Reeves made the difficult choice. The case would stay open but be listed as a cold case. That meant fewer active searches and fewer resources, although Reeves maintained that it didn't mean they were quitting. In a solemn press conference, Reeves spoke directly to the town. "We haven't given up. We're just recognizing that we need new evidence to continue. This case will never be closed until we find Freya." No one that day could have guessed how long that wait would be, or that the truth had already been uttered by witnesses early on, quietly placed in the din, concealed in plain sight like an upside-down puzzle piece. At the end of this chapter, the narrative changed. The evolution from active investigation to cold case wasn't something abrupt. It was a gradual waning, like a picture left in the sun. 4 months after Freya disappeared, by January 1998, the formerly buzzing phone line at headquarters remained idle for days on end. The wall of tips and leads, which had been so full, had dwindled to a bare, solitary bulletin board in the corner of the detective division. The mystery of what happened to Freya Harris was far from over. It was simply sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it again. If you're following this story, don't forget to give this video a like. It helps more people discover Freya's case. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from? Each Monday morning, Detective Reeves was faithful to his routine. He'd pour himself a strong coffee, sit in his chair, and open the heavy, dog-eared case file marked Harris Freya. It was a ritual now, not just a habit. It was almost sacred. Even with the passing months and no progress, he still had hope that somewhere within those pages lay something they'd overlooked. A minute detail, an overlooked clue. Something that would lead them back to Freya. But persistence could not prevent reality from sinking in. At a February staff meeting, Chief Wilson presented the harsh reality. "We have 3 new murders, a string of armed robberies, and a sexual assault," he told Reeves, staring at him across the table. "I just can't justify keeping officers on a case with no fresh leads." The one-time 12-member task force had gradually faded away. By spring, Reeves and only Officer Jennings, who'd been the first on the scene that evening Freya disappeared, were still around. A few months down the line, Jennings was transferred to patrol duty, and Reeves was left the last man standing, the only keeper of Freya's tale. "It's not abandoned," Reeves explained to David and Sarah Harris at their March 1998 monthly meeting. "It's just waiting for that one tip, that one piece of evidence that breaks everything open." Sarah, visibly thinner and hollow-eyed from months of sleepless nights, leaned across the desk. "And what if that tip never comes?" she asked quietly. Her voice trembled, not with anger but exhaustion. "What if that evidence is already in those boxes?" She pointed to the wall lined with file boxes stacked neatly in rows, each marked Harris F. "What if you've already talked to the person who took her?" Her words struck Reeves hard, for inside he had wondered the same thing. Statistically, in the case of child abduction, the perpetrator tended to be one who'd already been interviewed, someone who'd managed to slip through in plain sight. As the year progressed, there were other crimes that needed to be addressed. A double murder in April, a series of arson attacks during the summer, and a missing college student in October. That student was discovered within days, a bittersweet victory that reopened the wounds for the Harrises. David and Sarah still would not allow their daughter's memory to lapse. They started the Freya Harris Foundation together, initially to pay for private search missions, and subsequently to campaign for improved procedures in missing children's cases. Sarah was trained as a search and rescue volunteer, and she joined units that combed woods, fields, and streams for other missing individuals. Each search she participated in was a combination of hope and sadness, because each time she located someone else's child, she remembered that hers was still somewhere out there. David, on the other hand, focused his sorrow on learning. He developed an educational program called Freya's Rules for Safety, a child safety program that educated children on how to identify danger, travel with friends, and what to do if approached by a stranger. His presentations reached all over Minnesota and eventually to surrounding states. "We can't bring Freya home today," he would inform parents during these school assemblies, voice firm but eyes brimming with sorrow. "But perhaps we can prevent another family from enduring what we're going through." When the first anniversary of Freya's vanishing came in September 1998, the town came together again. Local television stations broadcast retrospectives. The St. Louis Herald ran a front-page article called 365 Days of Questions, describing the investigation and what it cost the town. National broadcasts such as Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted covered the story, and a flood of fresh tips sprang up, none of which amounted to anything. That evening, over 2,000 attended a candlelight vigil at the fairgrounds. The group quietly stood by the Ferris wheel where Freya was last spotted. Thousands of tiny candles burned in the darkness, illuminating the night like a starfield brought to Earth. It became an annual ritual, but as time went on, fewer individuals attended. The second anniversary attracted hundreds rather than thousands. By the 5th, only local journalists reported on it. By the 10th, it was only a footnote in the newspaper's On This Day in History section, but David and Sarah missed no vigil. They never ceased to distribute flyers featuring new age progression photos, each a ghostly vision of the daughter they might only dream would grow up apart from them, Freya's. Disappearance had grown more than a secret. It was a scar sewn into the very life of St. Louis County itself, a hushed, hollow reminder that even time couldn't mend what was gone. Freya Harris's disappearance didn't only leave a mark on one family, it affected the entire community of St. Louis. Prior to Freya, this was the sort of community where residents left front doors open and children spent hours riding bikes until dusk without giving it a second thought. But all that sense of small-town security disappeared overnight. Parents who previously granted their children independence imposed stringent check-ins. The playgrounds, once filled with shouts of delight and laughter, became eerily still unless parents manned a nearby presence. Linda Novak, principal at Lakeside Elementary, Freya's school, experienced the transformation firsthand. Before Freya, parents would deliver their kids to the front entrance, she said. Then they'd take them all the way to the classroom door and hover until they were safely inside. The school installed cameras, stiffened visitor ID procedures, and implemented stricter dismissal policies. As Linda described it, the innocence was gone. Even the county fair, once the summertime highlight, suffered. Attendance fell by almost 40% the summer following Freya's vanishing. New safety precautions were added, cameras, ID badges for employees, and parent-child wristbands, but it was too late. Too many families couldn't bear to go back to the site where horror had occurred. Almost 5 years passed before attendance returned, and even then, kids were never out of sight of their parents. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a child psychologist who served local families, explained the residual effect. "We refer to them as Freya's generation," she said. These children were raised with boundaries their older siblings never experienced. No walking to school by themselves, no playing outside unattended, constant communication. They learned a silent fear that became a part of daily existence. Local businesses evolved to accommodate these new fears. The ice cream store installed a walk-up window where parents could observe their kids from the outside. The library reconfigured its kids' area to remove blind spots and implemented a check-in system. Even the local pool began buddy systems and roll calls every hour. Law enforcement also adapted. Freya's incident became a case study, a stern reminder and an impetus to do better. The St. Louis Police Department completely revamped its protocol for missing persons, eliminating the old waiting period for kids and implementing immediate response protocols. They created regional alliances with surrounding jurisdictions to share resources and data more effectively. Officers revisited Freya's case annually in training, what succeeded, what didn't, and how no other family would have to go through the same horror. Former Sheriff Michael Donovan, who retired in 2005, later said, "Before Freya, I believed our job was to keep the peace. After Freya, I know our job is to keep the vulnerable safe." It's a different mental mindset, a different type of policing. For David and Sarah Harris, the subsequent years were a grinding pace of emotional stamina. Unlike households who are dealt the awful certainty of verified loss, they existed in suspended grief. They could not hope freely, and they could not mourn in full. "Not knowing is its own hell," Sarah told a tearful, emotional interview on the 15th anniversary of Freya's vanishing. "Each time they locate an unknown child somewhere in the nation, your heart just skips. Every blonde little girl you happen to see on the street makes you double take. You always wait, always prepare yourself for news, good or bad. The stress finally caught up with their marriage. David and Sarah broke up in 2006 for 3 months, then reunited through therapy. We knew we were the only two who really knew this hurt," David later said. "Pushing each other away was just enduring it by ourselves." At the same time, Detective Samuel Reeves remained good on his promise. Even after retiring in 2010, he maintained a tiny home office dedicated solely to Freya's case, files, photographs, and notes tidily organized, always at hand for the next big break. He sat down with his replacement, Detective Andrea Martinez, on a regular basis to share new forensic methods and other cases that may prove to have similar clues. Cold doesn't mean forgotten, Reeves might say to reporters in anniversary press conferences. Cold just means waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right tip to warm it back up. And his trust wasn't in vain. Between 100 and 150 cold case child disappearance cases are solved annually in the United States, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Every single one is a reminder. Sometimes justice is just slow to arrive. While most cold cases conclude in disappointment, with bodies eventually discovered after years of searching, approximately 30% yield some measure of resolution, living victims found, or criminals apprehended and convicted. Over the past 2 decades, technology has become the greatest ally in reopening those long-closed files. The rise of DNA science, especially familial DNA matching, has cracked open doors that once seemed sealed shut. Between 2004 and 2016, this method helped solve more than 40 abduction and murder cases that had gone cold for decades. And then genetic genealogy arrived, true game changer. Beginning sometime in 2018, investigators started employing commercial DNA databases to follow family trees of suspects through distant relatives. Unsolved cases stretching 30, 40, even 50 years sometimes received answers in a few weeks. But not only DNA, The digital age revolutionized investigative work throughout the board. Facial recognition, computer image enhancement, and even evidence review with AI provided detectives with new resources to revisit old leads. Huge databases could now scan millions of files, seeing patterns no human could have detected in the 90s. For the Harris family, and for retired Detective Samuel Reeves, these breakthroughs were like delicate strands of light cutting through darkness that had lasted for years. Each new cold case solved, each found child or caught abductor, was a reminder to them that Freya's case could still be saved. People wonder why we don't move on, Sarah Harris said during a 2012 community fundraiser for the Freya Harris Foundation. But that's just not how parenting is. You don't stop being a mother because you have no idea where your child is. You don't stop looking for her just because it's been years rather than days. Time doesn't make it less her and our daughter. By the 15th anniversary of Freya's vanishing, few remained in St. Louis who held on to the hope that the mystery would one day be solved. The case had long since gone cold. But the tale of that wide-eyed 10-year-old girl disappearing between a cotton candy booth and a Ferris wheel had long since been absorbed into the town's own DNA. A cautionary tale. A specter, a whispered legend from generation to generation. And then, just when hope looked lost forever, something miraculous happened. The first genuine break in the case emerged, and it was from a source so unexpected that detectives virtually wrote it off as another blind alley detective. Andrea Martinez didn't plan on cracking the Freya Harris case. When she was assigned to the St. Louis Cold Case Unit in 2012, it was to be a temporary stint. 6 months of paperwork, scanning old documents, and observing how the veterans operated before she went back to homicide. At 34, she was deemed too young for permanent status. Cold cases require patience, her lieutenant had told her. You're here to scan, sort, and learn, not to solve anything. But Martinez had other plans. The forensics technician's daughter, she had been brought up on tales of detectives solving impossible crimes by paying attention to what everybody else missed. So on her first day on the job, she requested the 5 oldest cases in years unsolved that the department had. At the very top of that pile was Freya Harris. I recall when she went missing, Martinez said to retired Detective Reeves when they met for the first time. I was 12 years old. My mom did not allow me to attend the fair that year because of what occurred. This case made me become a police officer. Reeves, at 68 now and quietly fighting stage 1 Parkinson's, still bore the burden of that inquiry. Even in retirement, he sat with the Harris family once every month, pursuing the occasional hotline lead. He reviewed Martinez with a combination of optimism and realistic skepticism. Every detective in the world wants to be the one to crack Freya Harris, he cautioned her. 15 years of detectives have had a try. What are you that's different? Martinez didn't hesitate. I'm not looking at what was there, she said. I'm looking at what wasn't. And with that, she began her deep dive, not by rereading old summaries or detective notes, but by combing through the raw evidence itself. Every interview transcript, every photo, every fingerprint analysis. She created a computer database listing each and every individual named in the case. Witnesses, suspects, relatives, fair workers, and even the investigators who'd originally handled the file. It was the sort of time-consuming, nitpicky work most detectives hated. But Andrea Martinez wasn't most detectives. Every one of the names in Freya Harris's file became an entry on Detective Martinez's growing matrix. She cross-checked every single one of them. Criminal backgrounds, addresses, work history, even the tiniest personal tie that could connect them to other perpetrators on the case. Individuals don't exist in a vacuum, she explained halfway through a department review 6 months into her deployment. They have histories, relationships, patterns. Sometimes the link that's important isn't clear until you chart everything. By then, her temporary 6-month rotation had already been twice extended. Her forensic digital archiving had revealed connections between several unsolved cases that had previously been unrelated. Staff began to see that her supposed clerical duties were revolutionizing the way the entire department perceived cold cases. Then, in March 2013, Martinez requested something bold that turned heads throughout the department. I would like to retest all of the physical evidence in the Harris case with modern technology, she explained to Chief Wilson. All of it. His chief almost raised an eyebrow off his forehead. The price tag alone would be huge. DNA testing in 1997 had been a luxury. Costly, time-consuming, and only for the most important items. Fewer than a dozen items from the fair had ever been analyzed. The stuffed penguin Freya was last photographed holding, a single strand of hair discovered near the Ferris wheel, and some samples from their leading suspects. But what Martinez was suggesting was a lot more ambitious. A complete reinvestigation through advanced DNA and genealogy techniques that did not even exist when Freya went missing. The technology we use today didn't exist back in 1997, she contended. Touch DNA is able to detect cells not visible to the human eye. Familial DNA comparison can lead to relatives of unidentified suspects. And with genetic genealogy, we can construct family trees from those profiles. Maybe the solution's been there all the time. We just didn't have the instruments to notice it. Chief Wilson, balancing the city's budget with the public's expectation for progress, made a compromise. Start small, he said. Test the 5 most promising items. If something turns up, we'll expand. Martinez nodded. She chose her 5 targets carefully, and unidentified. Fiber from the stuffed penguin, a partial fingerprint, lifted from the trash can where the toy was recovered, a cigarette, butt found near the service road, a discarded Ferris wheel, soda cup, and the very first swabs from the penguin's surface. Samples which had yielded ambiguous DNA in 1997. The process of testing was arduous. New-touch DNA methods could extract genetic material from even the most minute skin cells. But these were 15 years old, damaged, and delicate. The laboratory cautioned her that some might be too worn down to employ. As she waited for the results, Martinez shifted focus to another frontier, digital forensics. She acquired the original VHS surveillance tapes from the fair, grainy, jittery, and presumed useless. But using current enhancement software, she hoped to uncover things the 1997 team never could have. The first team was looking for Freya, or for someone obviously taking her, she told Reeves over coffee one afternoon. I'm looking for patterns, people who show up in multiple spots for no clear reason. Someone watching, waiting, frame by frame. The enhanced footage began to whisper its secrets. She spotted a maintenance employee showing up in 3 separate camera views within the critical 15-minute window. A man in a baseball cap whose trajectory intersected with the Harris family's more often than chance permitted, and a security guard who strayed from his designated route soon, after Freya was last seen. Martinez located each of them. The maintenance worker had long since relocated, out of state, but work records verified his assignments for the day. The fellow in the baseball cap was a father of 3, who came to the fair with his own family, now quietly residing in Florida, and security guard Ronald Meeks had passed away in 2006 from a heart attack. It feels like we're chasing ghosts. Martinez admitted to Sarah Harris during a difficult update meeting in June 2013. But sometimes, ghosts leave fingerprints. She couldn't have known how true that would turn out to be. 2 weeks later, the lab results arrived. 4 of the 5 samples came back empty. No usable DNA, no new leads. But the partial fingerprint lifted from the trash can told a different story. The technician called Martinez personally. We've got something, he said. It's not a full print, but there's enough ridge detail for AFS to run a comparison. It was the first glimmer of movement in months. In 1997, the same print had been rejected as too smudged, too incomplete to be worth anything. But things had changed since then. Fingerprint analysis was now capable of much more. The automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, now contained tens of millions more entries, criminal bookings, government job screenings, even military records. The print was entered and the search was initiated. Days became weeks. When the results finally came in, Martinez experienced that same gut blow, no match. It was the result we hoped for but didn't expect, she later documented in her case notes. If the individual who made that print had any kind of record, we'd have caught them years ago. Martinez wasn't a person to give up at no. She broadened the parameters. this time to include non-criminal fingerprint records, such as those gathered from civilian employment and federal service. 3 weeks later, while buried in another case file, a system alert flashed. Possible match detected. The print was not an exact match, but close enough to request manual review. 1 hour of comparison later, the fingerprint expert confirmed it. The print was on Edward Kane, a guy with no priors. His prints were in the database because he'd driven a school bus in 2001. Martinez immediately ran Kaney's name through her cold case database. Nothing. He wasn't a witness. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't even mentioned in the investigation. She gazed up at the board of faces on her office wall, everyone color-coded by affiliation to the case. Edward Kaney wasn't represented. "Who's this guy?" she whispered. "And why was his fingerprint on that dumpster?" An impromptu meeting was held with Chief Wilson and the county prosecutor. The background check revealed a shocking scenario. Kaney, in 1997, was 27 years old and had worked part-time as a security contractor for a company named Northland Security Services, the same company that had worked supplemental security for the county fair. Martinez stood transfixed. "He was there," she said to herself aloud. There was still digging to be done. Northland's records showed Kaney assigned to the Midway sector, the zone where the Ferris wheel stood. "But his name never surfaced in police documents. How did we miss him?" Reeves demanded when Martinez called him with the news. "We interviewed every guard on duty." The response lay hidden in Northland's ancient scheduling records. Kaney had been a sudden fill-in, summoned after another guard called in sick mere hours before the end of the shift. Amid the confusion when Freya went missing, the new roster was never forwarded to investigators, but even that wasn't the most chilling revelation. When Martinez checked Kaney's name against the National Sex Offender Registry, she came up blank. But when she broadened the search to aliases and prior legal names, something did register. Edward Kane had been legally renamed in 1995. His birth name? Edward Mercer. Martinez spoke the name under her breath. Mercer. It had triggered a memory. She scrolled through the aged witness reports until she came across it. The report from Elaine Winters, the grandmother who had witnessed a man in a blue shirt showing a young girl his toolbox near the Ferris wheel. Back in 1997, investigators had focused on the fair's maintenance workers, all of whom wore blue shirts. But Northland Security issued blue shirts too, slightly different in design, but close enough to confuse a witness seeing them from a distance. And when she queried national databases with the name Edward Mercer, a piece of his secret past emerged, a sealed juvenile record in another state. The crime, which he had committed as a 16-year-old, had been locked away from public view. It wouldn't have appeared under his new identity, and it wouldn't have triggered during his security background check. Now, finally, the pieces were falling into place, and then the ultimate verification, the penguin swab touch DNA testing, conducted with today's advanced methods not available in 1997. They'd discovered it, a partial male DNA profile from cells, deposited on the penguin's surface of Freya's stuffed penguin. It wasn't enough to make a complete identification, but it was sufficient to conduct a familial DNA search, a procedure that searches for close genetic relatives in national databases. When the tests were returned, Martinez's heart was racing. The system had picked up on a possible relative, a man with a conviction for drug charges in 2010. His surname? Kaney. He was cousin to Edward Kane. That genetic connection, added to the fingerprint ID and Kaney's unreported visit to the fairgrounds, provided investigators with the probable cause they required. For 15 long years, detectives had a promising suspect. Cold cases such as this confirm one thing, Martinez said to a local news team afterward. Persistence is rewarded. Comment below with today's weather where you are, while we continue to find out what happened next. Edward Kaney had constructed a life so unremarkable, it was nearly suspiciously bland. He was 42 years old and lived by himself in a small ranch-style house in Greenfield, a small town roughly 30 miles from St. Louis. Neighbors said he was courteous but aloof. He'd wave from the drive, maybe talk about the weather, said one neighbor. Nice guy, just never too personal. His home was neat, his grass meticulously manicured, his bills promptly paid. He was just normal, said his next-door neighbor for 8 years. Nothing about him jumped out. I guess that was the point. For the past decade, Caney had worked as a delivery driver for a regional medical supply company. The job kept him on the road 4 days a week, crisscrossing rural Minnesota and neighboring states. His boss had nothing but good things to say. Always on time, never a day off, he said. He enjoyed the long country routes, said the quiet aided him in thinking. The city runs are what most drivers compete for, so we were glad to have him take them. His home life was as unremarkable as his professional one. Divorced in his first 30 years, no children, and a Wisconsin girlfriend he visited on the odd weekend. He had some acquaintances, but no close friends. He bowled on Thursday evenings during the winter, went fishing during the summer, and shared the occasional Facebook photo of his catches or his trophies. On the surface, he seemed like the epitome of stability, but Martinez soon learned that this ordinary existence was no coincidence. It was a facade. The assumed name of Edward Mercer, now Edward Caney, had been only the beginning of a masterfully crafted makeover. Hours after he had identified Caney as his suspect, Martinez staged a surveillance operation. The mission required complete secrecy. If Caney caught wind of the investigation, he might destroy evidence or vanish altogether. 4 detectives rotated shifts, maintaining round-the-clock surveillance. They documented his movements, his routines, his habits. "We're not just watching him," Martinez told her team. "We're learning him. Patterns matter, and Caney's patterns were almost unnervingly precise. He departed for work each morning at precisely 5:45 a.m., stopping at the same service station for coffee. His routes varied by assignment, but his habits remained the same. He did not use certain highways. He stopped exclusively at official rest stops, not random pullouts. He's hyper-vigilant," observed Detective Wilson, one of the surveillance officers. "He constantly checks his mirrors, even on deserted roads. He never uses the same route home twice a week. This wasn't the pattern of a typical delivery driver. This was a person trained or conditioned to recognize patterns, to look out for tails." While the surveillance team took notes, Martinez delved deeper into Caney's sealed juvenile record, the one under his previous name. The report detailed a troubling episode. Edward Mercer was 16 when he broke into one family's house while they were on holiday. But it was not your run-of-the-mill burglary. He hadn't taken much, just some trinkets. Rather, he'd spent hours in the house, with almost an obsessive attention to the bedroom of the family's 9-year-old daughter. Police discovered photographs of him sitting with her clothes and toys, souvenirs of a sort. The judge, citing his youth and the absence of previous offenses, sent him to juvenile detention and required him to undergo counseling. What nobody then could have guessed was that the tendencies discovered in that file, the craving for control, the attraction to innocence, never ceased. They'd simply gone underground. When Edward Mercer became 18, his youth record was sealed as part of a rehabilitation program, eliminating the paper trail of that sickening burglary from his adolescence. 2 years down the line, he joined the Army, serving 4 years in an administrative role. His record was spotless, his honor discharge. On paper, he was a textbook soldier who had turned his life around. But when he came back to the world at age 24, things went quieter and more deliberate. He coasted through some security work, solid, stable jobs that provided access, routine, and anonymity. Then, at age 25, he formally changed his name to Edward Kane. For personal reasons, Detective Martinez was not fooled by the ploy. He knew systems, she said. He knew how to utilize legal processes to establish space between who he was and what he wanted to be. His military past was explored by the team, but his record yielded little, no misbehavior, no serious grievances. Yet a few of his former co-workers remembered strange things. One remembered how Kane kept newspaper articles on missing persons in a scrapbook. When questioned why, he'd blurtingly assert it was for a crime novel he was researching. Within week 2 of the surveillance, Martinez had obtained warrants for Kane's phone and internet history. What they discovered put another piece on the board. Kane's search history had sporadic but persistent searches for the Freya Harris case. Not enough to appear obsessed, but enough to indicate a sustained interest. He'd even gone to the Freya Harris Foundation website twice, making two $100 anonymous donations on the anniversary of her disappearance. "He's tracking," Martinez said to Chief Wilson. "He's watching us almost as much as we're watching him, seeing what we do and don't." The cell phone records provided an even more troubling portrait. Kane's routes took him close to schools, playgrounds, and youth sports fields much of the time, and there were recurring patterns of unexplained 15-30-minute stops in those locations. Not evidence of anything, perhaps, but deeply disturbing. 3 weeks into it, Martinez figured it was time to refer the case to the county prosecutor. With the DNA partial match, the fingerprint, and the increasing behavioral evidence, they had constructed a good circumstantial case. The prosecutor listened intently, then nodded. "You've got something strong," she conceded, "but not airtight. His attorney can claim he handled that toy while he was working as a security guard. We need something that puts him with Freya after she vanished." That something was found in an unlikely place: his finances. While combing through Kane's credit card records, financial analyst Teresa Huang noticed a curious recurring charge, every 3 months, to a storage facility in Duluth, nearly 200 miles away from his home. It made no sense. Why would someone so careful with money pay for a storage unit that far away? Huang asked. He has no other unnecessary expenses. Surveillance had verified it. Once a month, every month without exception, Kane went to Duluth alone, on a Sunday, and spent about half an hour at the plant before immediately returning home. No stops, no drop-bys. Simply in and out. Martinez asked for a warrant immediately. The team was deliberative in its planning, setting the search for a Tuesday, when Kane would be out on an all-night delivery, run in North Dakota. What they discovered within that 10x10 climate-controlled storage unit would plague investigators the remainder of their careers. It was spotless. Stacks of labeled plastic containers, a little desk, and a logbook that seemed to be right out of a museum catalog. Corkboard lined one wall, covered in newspaper articles regarding Freya's vanishing and dozens more missing children from throughout the Midwest. Each bin was filled with neatly arranged memorabilia, county fair tokens, security uniforms from years gone by, handwritten diaries of his daily routine and inner monologue. But the most stomach-dropping find came from a locked filing cabinet with the simplest label, FH. Inside, the officers discovered a blue jacket similar to the one Freya was last seen wearing, a hair ribbon that resembled her pictures, and a number of photographs of a young girl, most likely Freya unconscious or asleep in the back of a van. Martinez's hands trembled as she called into headquarters. Martinez was aware that they could no longer afford to be slow. "We have to go quickly," she instructed her team. "This is not just about what went down 15 years ago, the journals, the evidence. This is a pattern." Those journals, as it turned out, held the most horrifying reality of all. Kane had written in gruesome detail of Freya's kidnapping, but that was not all. He'd kept surveillance records of at least 7 other young women over the years. The logs mentioned opportunities and close calls, terminology that led investigators to believe he'd tried or seriously thought about taking others. It was the smoking gun they had been looking for. With it in hand, the prosecutor signed off on an arrest warrant straight away. To avoid the possibility of Kane going home and catching on that something was amiss, Martinez coordinated with North Dakota authorities to raid his motel room while he was still out on his delivery run. At 6:15 a.m. Wednesday, a tactical unit entered his motel room quietly and took him into custody without incident. His sole words? "Which one is this about?" That lone sentence iced all the officers present. As the detectives delved deeper, they could start to understand how Kane had evaded detection for so long. His association with the county fair, for example, wasn't a random one-shot security job. Records showed he'd worked that same fair 3 consecutive years under his former name, Edward Mercer. Following Freya's disappearance, he never went back, but he did take up security work at similar fairs in adjacent counties. He knew the fairgrounds like the back of his hand, Martinez later told the FBI in a briefing, who were now part of the expanded investigation. He knew the blind spots, the routine of the staff, the camera coverage, everything. He didn't just happen to find himself there that day. He'd been casing it. His diaries explained how he conducted Freya's kidnapping systematically, consciously. He was given the Midway area to watch over. He monitored the Harris family all day. He wrote down occasions when Freya strayed a couple of steps from her parents. Then, on one occasion when he noticed she was walking solo towards the Ferris wheel, he acted, prowling in uniform, relaxed, but assured. He explained to her there was a missing child who required assistance in figuring out whose parents they were and asked if she'd accompany him for a minute. Freya, believing the uniformed man, complied. He took her around the back of the Ferris wheel to a service corridor, saying the other security guard was waiting there. From there, he escorted her through a staff gate to the employee car park, where his van was waiting. It was all under 4 minutes. To anyone observing, it would have seemed totally innocent, a security guard assisting a child. No one would have suspected anything. What assisted him in avoiding capture subsequently was a class in manipulation. The name switch that interred his record as a juvenile. The 11th hour security task that left him absent from the official employee list. His sudden resignation immediately after the fair so that his name would not be mentioned in subsequent interviews. He knew how investigations go, Martinez said. Every time we widened the search or pursued a fresh lead, he'd already taken care to be 3 steps back from it. The most chilling revelation was how Kane had continued watching the case for years. He followed not just news reports or perused the Foundation website. He had actually shown up at 3 of the annual vigils for Freya. He'd stand silently in the back, observing the Harris family mourn, observing detectives talk, fading into the sea of people like a specter. He'd even approached Detective Reeves once, identifying himself as a concerned citizen who had an interest in how cold cases were resolved. "I recall him," Reeves said upon viewing Kane's photograph. "He had smart questions regarding storing evidence and new forensic methods. I figured he was a criminal justice student." Now, with all that they had learned, investigators were confronted with a chilling question. Had Kane committed this crime before? The journals suggested connections to at least 2 unsolved Wisconsin and 1 Michigan disappearance, but fell short of outright admissions. Task forces in those states started to reopen their cases, reworking old evidence based on Kane's arrest. For the St. Louis Police Department and for the Harris family, Kane's arrest unleashed a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, relief, anger, vindication, and a poignant question that hung over every conversation. Could Freya have been located sooner if anything, had gone differently in 1997? Hiding in plain sight, Martinez mused softly, providing security at the very occasion on which he committed the act. It's the best disguise. Who would ever suspect the guy who's wearing the badge designed to reassure you? The arrest of Edward Kane required almost military perfection. Since he was in Garrison, North Dakota, a tight-knit little town where everybody saw everything, one misstep might alert him. Detective Martinez consulted with local police to create a plan that would take him by surprise and reduce any likelihood of escape or harm. "We catch him off guard." Martinez instructed the team on the final planning call. No sirens, no uniforms, no flashing lights. Nothing that allows him to prepare. The North Dakota tactical team was in place by 5:30 a.m. Plainclothes officers filled the parking lot and lobby of the motel quietly. 2 others, posing as maintenance men, were stationed outside Kane's door. Unmarked state police cars waited to block any potential exit paths. At 6:12 a.m., the phone in Kane's motel room rang. A setup call from the front desk. It told him he had a problem with his credit card that he needed to address. 3 minutes later, Kane opened the door, already dressed for another routine day in his delivery uniform. But this day was different. He was greeted by officers with guns drawn. "Edward Kane, you're under arrest," the lead officer announced, moving swiftly before Kane could retreat. Witnesses said his face barely changed. No panic, no surprise. Just an eerie calm. He didn't resist as they cuffed him and read his Miranda rights. His only words, "Which one is this about?" A chill ran through the officers. The question implied what they all feared, that there might be other victims. In an hour, Kane was locked up in a county detention center, waiting to be shipped back to Minnesota. Martinez had one hard and fast demand: no public disclosure until she could personally notify the Harris family and make preparations for the inevitable media frenzy. Sarah and David Harris had been through this too many times before. Every few years came another update, another optimism-fueled phone call that ended in a letdown. So when Martinez requested to see them in person, they prepared themselves for more of the same: a courteous apology, a kind reminder that the case was still active. They sat side by side on the same couch in the living room where they'd overheard so many hurtful words all those years. Their hands locked together. When Martinez arrived, she was to the point. "We made an arrest," she said gently but firmly. "We have compelling evidence connecting a suspect to Freya's kidnapping directly." For a moment, the two parents did not budge. Then Sarah's hand went to her mouth and tears brimmed. David merely sat there, the weight of 15 years of weariness and grief momentarily erased from his face. "Who?" he asked, a single word representing 15 years of pain. Martinez carefully explained who Edward Kane was, his security job at the fair, his connection to the scene, and the evidence recovered from his storage unit. She deliberately spared them the worst details from the journals and photographs, promising to share everything when they were ready. When Martinez mentioned the blue jacket found in Kane's storage locker, Sarah whispered, "Is it really hers?" Martinez nodded. "The lab's running DNA confirmation, but description and size are the same." David's follow-up question was the toughest any parent could pose. "Is she—" He couldn't get the words out. Martinez locked eyes with him. "We don't know that yet," she said softly. "What we do have is sufficient to charge him with kidnapping, but we're still trying to put together the full case." That afternoon, a 3 p.m. press conference had been planned, but by noon, the rumor mill had already started to churn. Whispers were making their way through law enforcement circles, and nonstop calls were being received from reporters asking for confirmation. Instead of letting speculation get out of control, Chief Wilson decided to act. When the press room doors opened, the room was standing room only. Journalists who'd written about Freya's vanishing act 15 years prior stood shoulder to shoulder with younger reporters who'd only heard about the case in criminology textbooks. National media had dispatched full teams. The air crackled with tension. Everyone understood this was going to be huge. And for the Harris family, sitting at home, this was the moment they had spent half their lives waiting to witness. Today, the St. Louis Police Department, in coordination with several state and federal agencies, has arrested 42-year-old Edward Kane in connection with Freya Harris's 1997 disappearance, declared Chief Wilson, his voice stern and measured. "This arrest follows new evidence that came about through the tireless efforts of our cold case unit, specifically Detective Andrea Martinez." The instant the words were out of his mouth, the ripple was made. A sudden gasp seemed to sweep through St. Louis. The name Freya Harris had been synonymous with heartbreak and unresolved questions for years. Now it was associated with another name, Edward Kane, a man everyone thought they knew. To the community at large, Kane had presented himself as utterly normal, a dependable delivery man for a local medical supply firm, unobtrusively delivering goods to hospitals, clinics, and nursing homes. His teammates on the bowling league called him Ed, a good bowler with a withering sense of humor who never failed to buy the drinks when he won. The local volunteer fire department had even given him a Citizens Award 3 years earlier for helping evacuate an elderly couple during a wildfire. "I just can't believe it," said Thomas Larson, captain of Kane's bowling team, as cameras swarmed outside their usual alley. "We've known him for years. He was at my daughter's graduation party last summer. There's no way." Throughout Greenfield, incredulity reverberated in the neighborhoods where Kane had lived unobtrusively for almost a decade. "There has to be some error," adamant Eleanor Winters, his elderly neighbor. "Ed plows my driveway every winter without me even having to ask him. He's not capable of such a thing." But as the gruesome details of the Duth storage unit started seeping out, the journals, the photos, the little boy's jacket, shock gave way to horror. And horror made way for guilt. Parents who had waved at Kane as he drove by suddenly recalled every smile, every passing word, every second he'd been around their children. "He was always present," said one mother to a reporter in tears. "At the park, the school carnivals, the fairs, we assumed he was being friendly." Media hysteria was unrelenting. News vans and satellite trucks clogged the sidewalk outside the St. Louis Police Department. Reporters hunted down Kane's former colleagues, military comrades, and bosses at old security gigs. His former wife, remarried and residing in Oregon, made a brief statement through her lawyer. "I am shocked and devastated. I ask for privacy as I process this news." National morning television programs broadcast pieces called "The Man Behind the Mask" and "When Monsters Look Like." Neighbors, true crime podcasts, put out emergency episodes within hours, analyzing every detail known. On social media, amateur detectives spun theories linking Kane to missing persons cases in the Midwest. For David and Freya Harris, the abrupt media storm was confirmation and torment. For 15 years, they had pleaded for public notice. Now they could hardly catch their breath under the crush of it. Media representatives set up camp outside their residence. Letters, flowers, and sympathy cards cluttered their front porch. Some givers sent sincere prayers. Others sent probing questions. David Harris said, in a brief statement, wary thanks. "We appreciate law enforcement for their diligence and for this arrest. But we do request privacy while we sort this out and remain in cooperation with investigators." As the community sorted through the news, emotions ebbed in waves, shock, then rage, then introspection. How had a man like Kane flown under the radar? How had someone in an authority uniform fallen through every trap? The reporters questioned former Sheriff Donovan, who had commanded the initial 1997 investigation. "We spoke to every employee on the official payroll," he replied defensively. "If his name wasn't given to us, we wouldn't have known he was there. We did everything according to procedure." But for many, according to procedure no longer seemed enough. Churches throughout St. Louis conducted prayer services for the Harris family and for a community looking for closure. The vigil site at the fairgrounds each year was transformed overnight into a shrine. Candles, flowers, pieces of paper with handwritten messages, and pictures of a beaming little girl with bright eyes and cotton candy clutched in her hand. At Greenfield schools, the children were counseled about the news. Some had met Mr. Kane from community gatherings. Others recalled him distributing water bottles at softball tournaments. Parents were speechless. "How do you inform a child," one teacher whispered, "that the person they were taught to trust, the man in the safety vest, the helper, was the person to whom they needed protection?" "The most difficult aspect," said local child psychologist Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who had worked for decades with families recovering from trauma, "is the betrayal. Not only that perhaps he committed this horrific act, but that he lived among us. He was one of us. It makes people question everything, their judgment, their sense of safety, even their gut feeling about who can be trusted." For Detective Reeves, retired now and observing the case from a peaceful house far away from the mayhem, the arrest brought up complicated feelings. "I talked to him once," he said to Detective Andrea Martinez by phone shortly after news of the arrest surfaced. "He asked me questions about the investigation. I answered all his questions. I never had a suspicion." "None of us did," Martinez answered quietly. He constructed his whole life around avoiding suspicion. As Edward Kane was extradited to Minnesota for arraignment, the citizens of Greenfield and St. Louis County were confronted with a stark reality. The man they had waved to for so many years was one who was capable of unspeakable evil. The horror wasn't in what he was accused of doing, but in how neatly he had camouflaged himself right before them, a ghost moving through their lives for almost 15 years, unremarked. The St. Louis County Courthouse had never been busier on a morning like that of Kane's arraignment. Security was more stringent than at most federal trials. Metal detectors at all entrances, canine sweeps of the corridors, officers patrolling every hallway. It resembled the trial of a terrorist, not that of a former delivery man from Greenfield. The measures were called for. The public's anger had boiled over. Threats poured in, some from strangers on the internet, others from neighbors who could not come to terms with their sorrow. When Edward Kane arrived at court, wearing an orange jumpsuit and wrists and ankles shackled, a hush hung over the room. Parents of Freya's past classmates, reporters, and locals occupied every seat. They leaned forward, desperate to glimpse the face of the man who looked so poignant and plain. Edward Kane. Judge Eleanor Winters started, her tone firm but level. You are indicted for kidnapping in the first degree, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Kane spoke so softly that it was almost a whisper. Not guilty, he said. The court reporter requested him to say it again. He did, softly as well. The prosecution, whose leader was District Attorney Rebecca Lawson, had no hesitation in asking for Kane to be held without bail on the grounds of him being a flight risk. Investigators had discovered $23,000 in cash along with various fake IDs, which were stashed in a secret compartment within his residence. Not even Kane's defense lawyer, Michael Stern, objected. He was well aware of no judge in America allowing bail under such conditions. Throughout the succeeding months, the pretrial hearings unveiled the prosecution's meticulous plan. Element by element, they tied Kane to Freya's vanishing through DNA remnants, recovered possessions and incriminating entries in his journals discovered in that storage facility. Meanwhile, the defense attempted a new strategy. The 15-year delay between the crime and the arrest rendered a fair trial impossible, they asserted. Evidence could be tainted. Memories of the witnesses could lapse. You can't construct a solid case, Stern insisted, on specters of the past. But as the pile of physical evidence mounted, the walls began closing in on Kane. 6 months into the trial, a surprise twist emerged. Confronted with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of new charges from other states, Kane pleaded out. My client, Stern made public in court, will plead guilty to kidnapping Freya Harris and give a complete confession of his deeds. In exchange, he asks for protective custody and that the death penalty be removed from consideration. The verdict divided the town. There were some who insisted on a full trial and all the grim details aired in public court. But for the Harris family, the plea provided something more, answers, and possibly a closure to 17 years of anguish. Following grueling, agonizing sessions with prosecutors, they decided to endorse the bargain. On a chilly February morning in 2014, Edward Kane stood before Judge Winters and quietly pleaded guilty to what he had done. In a flat, emotionless tone, he recounted how he used his security guard uniform to gain Freya's trust the evening of the county fair. He said she was wanted by her parents. She went with him willingly. He took her to his van, took her north, out of state, to a secluded cabin in Wisconsin, a location he had readied weeks earlier. Each word was like a knife turning deeper into the hearts of those who heard. He spoke unapologetically, without hesitation. The courtroom, hushed except for his words, seemed to shrink beneath the burden of it. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air vents. Each word of Edward Kane seemed to chill the air around him. He spoke bluntly, coldly, of the days after the kidnap. He confessed to holding Freya Harris prisoner for close to a week. Then there was an allegation that sent a shiver of skepticism around the room. He claimed Freya had died from an asthma attack, a condition her medical history confirmed she never had. For Kane, he freaked out. He hid her body deep in the woods behind the isolated cabin in northern Wisconsin, a land that had, over the years, been converted into a lakeside resort. Investigators lost no time. Hours after the confession, forensic teams were on the scene sweeping through what was now neat resort grounds. For 3 slow days, they dug up the spot outlined in Kane's confession. Then, buried under a patch of soil within the tree line, they uncovered what everyone had dreaded, remains matching a child of Freya's height and weight. Dental records verified the fact carried in the Harris family's hearts for 16 years. Freya never had left Wisconsin alive. 2 months afterwards was the sentencing hearing, a day that captured national attention. In the plaza outside the courthouse, hundreds of individuals, candles in hand and with pictures of Freya, gathered. Inside the courthouse, her parents waited to confront the man who had stolen everything from them. Due to her own personal involvement in the case, Judge Winters had recused herself. Handling the case in her stead was Judge Marcus Thompson, a man famous for his uncompromising attitude toward crimes against children. Prior to me pronouncing sentence, Thompson stated, his tone measured but thick with emotion, I will hear impact statements from the victim's family. Sarah Harris stepped slowly to the podium, holding a picture of her daughter in a framed photograph. She'd spent 16 years dreaming of this day, what she'd say if she ever had the chance to stand in front of the man who ruined her life. When she finally began to speak, she sounded serene, too serene. You didn't just steal a kid, she started, addressing Kane directly. You stole first dances and driver's ed lessons. You stole graduation and college forms. You stole wedding days and grandkids. You stole our future and traded it for 16 years of wondering. Next was David Harris. He had less to say, but his words weighed the same as the whole community. You didn't change our family, he spoke softly. You changed the town. You scared children away from playing outdoors. You made parents doubt every second of protection. Whatever sentence you face, know that we received a longer one. The difference is, today our sentence is over. Yours has just started. Edward Kane, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, the maximum of this plea agreement. He also instructed Kane to compensate the Harris family and reimburse the expenditure of the gigantic, decades-long search parties that had crossed several states. No punishment can give back what's been lost, the judge stated, his voice grave. But justice insists you spend each of the remaining days of your life thinking about what you've done. Kane didn't blink as he was escorted away, chains clinking against the tile floor. Weeks later, Freya's body was finally brought back home. Her funeral, 16 years too late, was filled with hundreds who had never lost hope that she would return. The small white church was packed with neighbors, classmates, police officers, and strangers who had read about her for years. From tragedy, progress arose in an odd sort of way. The forensic methods applied to Freya's case, extracting DNA from degraded evidence, updating decades-old security footage, became the norm in cold case investigations nationwide. The digital database system developed by Detective Andrea Martinez was implemented nationwide and helped crack other old cases as well. For the Harris family, closure was not peace, but it was knowing. We always knew. Inside, said Sarah Harris later to Martinez. But knowing and accepting are two different things. Now we can finally recall Freya, rather than look for her. 2 decades since the disappearance of Freya Harris between a cotton candy booth and a Ferris wheel, St. Louis, Minnesota remains changed. The yearly vigil that previously represented an unsolved tragedy is now a celebration of strength, of a people who refuse to forget. Candles still burn, flowers still lie beneath the memorial sign. But now they commemorate not just the girl who was taken, but the resilience of those who kept her memory alive. This case teaches us that justice does arrive, sometimes many decades later. If you found Freya's story meaningful, hit subscribe and share this video with someone who believes in the power of persistence. What cold cases would you like to see us cover next? The Freya Harris Memorial Garden, sown alongside the tiny elementary school she attended as a child, erupts each spring. The perennials, with deliberate selection by her mother, come back year after year, a living reminder that memory can survive. Even the most protracted winters, what started out as one, families' frantic quest for answers eventually reoriented. The way the country conducts missing persons. Investigations nationwide, police forces have embraced the Freya Protocol, a suite of guidelines straight out of the case that transformed everything. It focuses on thorough evidence protection, electronic cataloging of every connection between cases, and regular revisiting of cold files with the help of advanced forensic equipment. Every review starts with a single prime question. What might we be able to see today that investigators were unable to see earlier? Detective Andrea Martinez, who now oversees the newly enlarged cold case unit, teaches a new wave of investigators on this premise. Technology changes, she says to them, but so does vision. Oftentimes, what cracks a case isn't fresh evidence, it's fresh eyes. One of Freya's most lasting legacies continues through the foundation that is named for her. The Freya Harris Foundation, born from her parents' grief, has grown into a nationwide lifeline for families of missing children. What started as a grassroots awareness effort has now helped locate over 200 missing kids and provide counseling, legal support, and advocacy for hundreds more. David Harris's child safety curriculum, which was once a straightforward pamphlet that was given out at county fairs, is now included in the regular curriculum of elementary schools across the Midwest, teaching kids how to be safe without being fearful. For detectives who are confronted with the endless, cold hallways of unsolved crimes, Freya's case is both a warning story and a spark of hope. It reminds them that justice delayed doesn't necessarily equal justice denied, that the key clue may already be out there, quietly waiting in a box, a file, a forgotten fingerprint, until technology, a detective, and the timing come along to unlock it. Ultimately, the legacy of Freya Harris is not only in the tragedy of her loss, but in what followed. Her tale reminds us that truth is important, even if it comes decades too late. That perseverance can transform heartbreak into forward motion, and that healing starts, not when we forget, when we simply get it. Thanks for watching this compelling true crime tale. If Freya's tale touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to ensure more tales such as this find their way into the ears of those who must hear them. Which cold case should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below.